The email came at 4:47 p.m. on a Thursday, disguised as a routine calendar invite. Subject line: exit strategy, consultation with Vanessa from HR. Like they were helping me plan a vacation instead of planning my professional funeral. I clicked it anyway because what else was I going to do? Pretend I didn't see the writing on the wall that had been spray painted in neon since the new leadership team arrived 3 months ago with their MBA buzzwords and their restructuring deck that looked like it was designed by someone who thought Synergy was a vitamin supplement. The conference room smelled like desperation and vanilla air freshener, the kind they pump through the HVAC system to mask the stench of broken dreams and middle management tears. Vanessa had that practiced HR smile, the kind that says, "I'm about to ruin your life." But I took a mindfulness seminar, so I'll do it with intention. She was wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, sitting behind a mahogany desk that screamed, "I make decisions about your life from behind imported wood." She gestured to the chair across from her like she was inviting me to my own wake. The folder was already there, waiting thick, glossy, ominous, sitting next to a box of tissues that felt more like a threat than a courtesy and a company branded pen. Because apparently they wanted me to sign my own execution warrant with their logo on it. "Thanks for coming in, Jenna." She said my name like she was tasting something bitter. "We really appreciate everything you've brought to the team over the past 8 years." Everything past tense. Like I was already dead, buried, forgotten a line. Item in next quarter's cost reduction summary. She opened the folder with the ceremony of someone unveiling a tombstone and slid it across the polished surface like she was dealing cards in a game where the house always wins. I opened it, and there it was, my corporate death certificate disguised as a separation agreement, 12 pages of legal gibberish that boiled down to, "Here's some money, now, shut up forever and disappear, like you never existed." The severance was generous. I'll give them that 6 months salary plus benefits continuation, plus a little extra padding for what they called transition support, which sounded like therapy. Money for the trauma they were about to inflict, but buried in paragraph 7, subsection C, was the real meat of the sandwich, a non disclosure agreement, so airtight it would make the CIA jealous, written in language so dense it could have been carved from concrete. I couldn't talk about company practices, leadership decisions, operational challenges, internal communications, strategic initiatives, vendor relationships, client interactions, financial irregularities, safety protocols, compliance procedures, or anything that might reflect poorly on the organization, which basically meant I couldn't mention that our entire customer service system was held together with duct tape and the tears of unpaid interns who'd been promised real experience but got handed headsets and a script written by someone who clearly hated both customers and human dignity, or that our compliance department consisted of one guy named Trevor who Googled regulations during his lunch break while eating sad desk salads and pretending he understood international trade law, or that our CFO, Rodrigo, had tried to hide a $250,000 accounting error by burying it in the office supply budget. Because apparently he thought creativity in bookkeeping was the same as creativity in interior decorating. I looked up at Vanessa, who was watching me like a nature documentary narrator, waiting for the gazelle to realize the lions were closing in. Her manicured fingers drummed against the desk in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown timer. "This is very generous," I said slowly, flipping through pages that felt heavier than they should. "What exactly am I not supposed to talk about?" She did that head tilt thing HR people do when they're about to gaslight you into thinking water isn't wet and gravity is just a suggestion. "Oh, it's just standard language," she chirped like a bird trained to repeat corporate mantras. "Nothing specific, just protecting proprietary information, trade secrets, intellectual property, that sort of thing. You understand we have to protect the company's interests, especially during this transition period." I flipped to page 9 where the NDA got specific and my blood pressure spiked. Like I just mainlined espresso mixed with pure anxiety. They wanted me to promise I'd never discuss the Henderson account disaster where we accidentally shipped 50,000 units of expired product to a children's hospital because someone in logistics thought expiration dates were more like suggestions and quality control was handled by an intern who thought due diligence meant looking at paperwork really, really hard, or the time our CFO, Rodrigo, tried to hide a $250,000 accounting error by spreading it across 17 different budget categories like some kind of financial shell game where the P was made of embezzlement and the shells were made of creative interpretation of generally accepted accounting principles. Or the fact that our head of safety, Blake, had been signing off on inspections for facilities he'd never actually visited because he was too busy running his side business selling essential oils to soccer moms, and apparently thought aromatherapy could fix structural engineering problems. Hey, if you're watching this and thinking, damn, that sounds familiar, then you're part of the 3% who don't just scroll past corporate horror stories without hitting that subscribe button. 97% of people watching will ghost me like Vanessa ghosted basic human decency. So if you're still here, prove you're part of the resistance and smash that button. Like it owes you 6 months of unpaid overtime and weekend work that was never acknowledged in your performance review. Back to my public execution disguised as a career transition, meeting standard language, my ass. This was a muzzle with a bow on it, a gag, order dressed up in corporate speak, and legal jargon that probably took 3 attorneys and a dictionary of euphemisms to write. They wanted to buy my silence like it was a commodity they could add to their quarterly budget under miscellaneous expenses, right? Between office supplies and witness intimidation, I set the folder down and looked Vanessa dead in the eye, feeling my spine straighten like it was remembering how to be made of steel instead of the corporate jello I'd been molded into over 8 years of meetings about meetings and synergy sessions that achieved nothing except wasting everyone's time. I need time to review this with my attorney. Her smile faltered like a bad internet connection buffering on the worst possible moment. Of course, she said, though I should mention this offer expires in 72 hours after that. Well, the company's position might change, and she'd emphasize change like it was a threat wrapped in tissue paper. The subtext was clear. As a fire alarm sign now, or we'll make this harder for you than it needs to be. And trust me, we have creative ways to make departing employees lives complicated. The threat was wrapped in corporate speak, but it was still a threat delivered with the same tone you'd use to offer someone a mint while pointing a gun at their kneecap. I gathered my things with the same dignity you'd use to collect roadkill, stood up and shook her hand like we'd just discussed the weather. Rather than my professional assassination, her palm was damp with the sweat of someone who knew they were doing something morally questionable, but had convinced themselves it was just business, just standard procedure, just the way things worked in the real world. I'll be in touch, I said, and walked out of that beige carpeted tomb they called an office building, past the motivational posters that said things like teamwork makes the dream work while they were systematically destroying any sense of actual teamwork, past the reception desk where someone had put up a sign that said, "We appreciate our employees," right next to a stack of separation agreements that suggested otherwise. But here's the thing about being backed into a corner. Eventually, you stop looking for exits and start looking for weapons, and sometimes the weapons are hiding in plain sight, wrapped in the very documents they're using to attack you. I drove home in a fog of rage and adrenaline, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was Vanessa's neck, replaying every word, every pause, every calculated smile that said, "You're disposable and we both know it." But there's a difference between disposable and defeated, and they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. My apartment felt smaller when I walked in, like the walls had moved closer together while I was gone. Or maybe it was just the weight of institutional betrayal pressing down on everything, making the air thicker, the silence heavier, the future more uncertain. I dropped the folder on my kitchen table next to a stack of unpaid bills and a coffee mug that said, World's okayest employee, which felt more like prophecy than humor. Now I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey, the good stuff I'd been saving for a celebration that was looking increasingly unlikely, and sat down to read every single word of their corporate suicide pact, page by page, clause by clause, searching for loopholes like I was diffusing a bomb. Because in a way, they were trying to blow up my ability to ever speak truth about what really happened in that glass tower of dysfunction and incompetence. But bombs have trigger mechanisms, and sometimes, if you're careful and a little bit lucky, you can trace the wires back to the person holding the detonator. That's when I found it buried in the appendix section like a landmine in a flower garden schedule. B, attached hereto and incorporated by reference as if fully set forth herein, which was legal. Speak for, we're going to list everything we're terrified you might talk about and hope you don't notice. We just confessed to 17 different types of corporate malfeasance. I flipped to Schedule B and nearly choked on my whiskey. It was a list of everything I wasn't allowed to discuss, and they'd been thorough, obsessively, thoroughly, criminally thorough. They'd listed specific incidents by date, project code, internal reference numbers, and enough detail to make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. The Henderson account debacle was listed as Project Sunrise because apparently our executives thought they were running a summer camp instead of a business that shipped medical supplies. The accounting irregularities were Project Moonbeam, which sounded like something a stoned intern would name after a weekend music festival. The safety violations were Project Rainbow because nothing says we're hiding OSHA violations like naming your cover up after a meteorological phenomenon that only appears after storms. But here's what they didn't realize in their rush to silence me. They'd just handed me a roadmap to every skeleton in their closet, a comprehensive guide to corporate malfeasance with dates, locations, project codes, and enough specific detail to corroborate everything with documentary evidence. They'd basically said, here's everything we're terrified you might talk about. Please promise. You won't tell anyone about these specific crimes we definitely committed, while also providing you with enough information to prove we committed them. I laughed until my sides hurt, then I laughed some more because the beautiful irony was that I'd been a mid level operations manager with clearance to know about operational issues, but not necessarily financial fraud or systematic safety violations. I knew some of this stuff, but not all of it, not the scope, not the scale, not the criminal creativity involved in covering it up. I didn't know about Project Moonbeam until they helpfully included it in my silence agreement. I didn't know the Henderson thing had a code name or that there were 17 other incidents they were worried about. They just educated me on my own ammunition, like handing someone a gun, then helpfully pointing out where all the bullets were hidden and providing detailed instructions on how to load and fire the weapon. I spent the weekend researching project codes, cross referencing dates with my old emails, digging through archived files I'd copied to my personal drive during routine backup procedures, and building a timeline that read like a corporate crime novel written by someone with a law degree and a grudge against capitalism by Sunday night. I had a clearer picture of systematic failures, cover ups, regulatory violations, and outright fraud than I'd ever had as an employee. They'd given me the keys to their castle and asked me not to drive through the gates, but they'd forgotten to mention that I now knew where all the secret passages were hidden and which doors led to the treasure room filled with evidence. I called my attorney Monday morning, a shark named Patricia Rodriguez who charged enough per hour to fund a small country but had a reputation for making corporate executives weep into their golden parachutes while simultaneously updating their resumes and considering career changes in industries that didn't require them to look whistleblowers in the eye. I laid out the whole situation, the generous severance offer, the comprehensive end The beautiful, beautiful Schedule B that detailed every dirty secret they were desperate to hide, like a confession, written by someone who thought confession was supposed to be private. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds that either meant she was impressed or calculating how much she could bill for this case, or possibly both, because good attorneys are excellent at multitasking, especially when corporate malfeasance and billable hours intersect in beautiful harmony. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that precedes either very good news or very expensive news. Then she said something that made my heart sing, like a choir of avenging angels backed by a full orchestra playing the theme from a legal thriller. They just handed you a whistleblower case, gift wrapped with a bow and a comprehensive instruction manual. The beauty of federal whistleblower protections is that they trump corporate NDAs, like a royal flush beats a pair of twos. You can't sign away your right to report criminal activity or regulatory violations to the appropriate authorities and schedule. Be read like a shopping list of potential violations written by someone who wanted to make sure federal prosecutors didn't miss anything important. SEC violations for the accounting irregularities, FDA violations for the expired product shipments, OSHA violations for the safety inspection fraud, and possibly mail fraud, wire fraud, and securities fraud, depending on how creative they'd gotten with their documentation and reporting to federal agencies. We weren't talking about hurt feelings or corporate gossip or the kind of workplace drama that makes for good water cooler conversation. We were talking about potential criminal activity that put people at risk, violated federal law, and generated the kind of paper trail that makes federal agencies very, very interested in your business practices. Patricia explained that under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the False Claims Act, and several other federal whistleblower protection statutes, I was not only allowed to report these violations, I was potentially entitled to compensation for doing so. Whistleblower awards could range from 10% to 30% of any government recovery, which, depending on the scope of the violations, could dwarf my severance package by a factor of 10 or more. But she cautioned me this wasn't about the money, this was about doing the right thing. And oh, by the way, completely destroying the people who thought they could buy my silence with 6 months of salary and a legal document that accidentally confessed to multiple federal crimes. She said she'd need 48 hours to review everything, cross reference the violations with federal statutes, research recent case law, and prepare our response that would make their legal department question their career choices and possibly their life decisions. We weren't just going to decline their hush money, we were going to decline it in a way that made them realize they'd accidentally brought a confession to a gunfight. Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from Vanessa's assistant, a nervous young woman whose job apparently included following up on corporate extortion attempts, wondering if I'd had a chance to review the separation agreement and whether I'd like to schedule a follow up meeting to finalize everything. The desperation in her voice was delicious, like hearing someone beg for mercy through a customer service script while slowly realizing the customer has all the power and knows exactly how to use it. I told her I'd be responding by end of business Wednesday and left it at that. Let them sweat, let them wonder, let them start Googling employment attorneys and updating their LinkedIn profiles because the storm was coming and they were about to find out what happens when you try to silence someone who's spent 8 years documenting your mistakes. Patricia's response letter was a masterpiece of legal warfare, disguised as professional correspondence, the kind of document that makes opposing counsel need therapy and corporate executives reconsider their life choices. Subject line: response to separation agreement and disclosure concerns. Dear Ms. Chen and corporate leadership team, thank you for your recent separation offer and the comprehensive documentation provided therein. After careful review with counsel, we must respectfully decline the proposed agreement as currently structured, the attached schedule. B, while presumably intended to clarify confidentiality, Expectations has instead highlighted several matters that may warrant disclosure to relevant regulatory authorities under federal whistleblower protection statutes accordingly. We cannot, in good conscience, agree to restrictions that might impede our clients' legal obligations to report potential violations of securities regulations, safety standards, public health protections, and federal law. We look forward to your prompt response regarding these concerns and to discussing terms that recognize both our clients' rights and the company's legitimate interests. Sincerely, Patricia Rodriguez, attorney for Jenna Walsh attached, was a counterproposal that made their original severance look like lunch money. We wanted 12 months' salary, not six. We wanted extended benefits coverage, not basic continuation. We wanted a clean separation letter, not the passive aggressive performance review they'd probably drafted. And most importantly, we wanted them to formally acknowledge that nothing in any agreement would restrict my right to communicate with regulatory authorities about potential violations of federal law. The silence that followed was deafening. No phone calls, no follow up emails, no casual run ins at the coffee shop near the office. It was like I'd been erased from their reality, or maybe they were too busy having emergency meetings with their attorneys and trying to figure out how exactly they'd managed to accidentally confess to multiple federal crimes in a separation agreement until Thursday at 2:17 p.m. when my phone rang, unknown number, but I recognized the area code. Corporate headquarters. Hello, Jenna. This is Blake Morrison, our chief legal counsel. I understand you have some concerns about the separation agreement. His voice was carefully modulated, like he was talking someone off a ledge or negotiating with terrorists, which in a way he was, because I was holding enough evidence to terrorize their quarterly earnings. I have concerns about a lot of things, Blake, I said, settling into my couch with a cup of coffee that tasted better than any I'd ever had at the office. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss this face to face. He suggested there might be room for adjustment in the terms, which was corporate. Speak for please don't destroy us. We'll give you whatever you want. Just please don't call the federal agencies. Of course, there was room for adjustment. There was room for a whole damn football stadium of adjustments because they'd just realized they'd accidentally handed me a nuclear weapon and asked me to promise not to use it. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at Patricia's law firm, which felt like home. Field advantage with bulletproof legal walls and the kind of atmosphere that makes corporate executives sweat through their expensive suits. Blake brought back up a woman introduced as their head of risk management, whose job title basically meant professional panic attack coordinator, and another attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, including prison or tax court or a customer service call center. The energy in the room was spectacular, like watching someone realize they'd bet their house on a horse with three legs. Patricia laid out our position with surgical precision. My client cannot agree to restrictions that would prevent her from fulfilling potential legal obligations to regulatory authorities. The violations outlined in your own schedule. B may constitute serious breaches of federal law that require disclosure to protect public safety and the integrity of regulatory systems. Blake's face went through several color changes, settling on the pale green of someone who just realized they'd accidentally confessed to multiple crimes in writing. While trying to cover them up, we never intended to restrict legitimate whistleblower activities, he said weakly, like someone claiming they never intended to rob a bank while holding a bag of money and a note that said, "This is a robbery?" Then perhaps you shouldn't have created a comprehensive list of potential violations and asked her to promise never to discuss them. Patricia replied with the kind of smile that makes opposing counsel update their resumes and consider career changes. By the end of that meeting, they'd agreed to our terms, every single one: the increased severance, the extended benefits, the clean separation letter, and most importantly, a formal acknowledgement that I retained all rights to communicate with regulatory authorities about potential violations of federal law. They were so eager to make this go away. They probably would have agreed to name a conference room after me and throw in a parking space with my name on it. I signed the new agreement that Friday morning and walked out of Patricia's office, feeling like I'd just won the lottery and a chess match simultaneously while also receiving a PhD in corporate warfare. But the beautiful thing about federal whistleblower protections is they don't require you to stay silent just because you've signed a separation agreement. 3 weeks later, I submitted detailed reports to the SEC, the FDA, OSHA, and several other federal agencies outlining every violation I'd witnessed, documented, or discovered through their helpful schedule. B. The Henderson account alone triggered a federal investigation that resulted in a $223 million fine and a consent decree. The accounting irregularities led to a broader audit that uncovered systematic revenue manipulation and resulted in executive terminations. The safety violations resulted in surprise inspections that shut down 2 facilities, pending compliance reviews, and led to a complete overhaul of their safety protocols. And my whistleblower award for reporting these violations was significantly more than the severance they'd tried to use to buy my silence, proving that sometimes the best way to get paid is to tell the truth, especially when the truth involves federal crimes. 6 months later, I got a LinkedIn message from Trevor, the guy who used to Google regulations during his lunch break. Apparently, he'd been promoted to head of compliance after Blake Morrison quietly resigned to pursue other opportunities, which is corporate speak for. He was fired and escorted out of the building. By security, Trevor wanted to thank me because the federal investigations had forced the company to actually invest in proper compliance systems, real training, real oversight, real accountability. He said it was like working for a completely different company, one that actually cared about following the law instead of hiding behind legal agreements and hush money. Vanessa from HR also reached out through a mutual connection. She'd left the company too, apparently having a comprehensive list of corporate violations attached to a failed NDA attempt doesn't look great on your HR performance review. She was working for a nonprofit now, helping whistleblowers navigate the reporting process, which felt like the kind of poetic justice you usually only see in movies or very satisfying revenge fantasies. The best part, though, was the company's annual report the following year, where they proudly announced their new commitment to transparency and ethical business practices, citing recent investments in compliance systems and regulatory oversight. They'd literally turned their attempt to silence me into a corporate rebranding opportunity because nothing says ethical business practices like getting caught by your own former employee and having to pay federal fines to prove you learned your lesson. I never did find out whose brilliant idea it was to include Schedule B in my separation agreement, but whoever it was, they deserve a thank you card because they accidentally turned what should have been a routine corporate execution into the most expensive lesson in federal whistleblower law that company ever received. And the funniest part is they paid me twice, once to keep quiet and once for speaking up, proving that sometimes the best way to handle a company trying to buy your silence is to sell it back to them at a premium with federal interest and regulatory oversight included in the package. They wanted to pay me to forget what I knew. Instead, they ended up paying me to remember everything and share it with the people whose job it is to make sure companies like that learn the difference between standard business practices and federal crimes. Thanks for watching, you Legends of Transparency. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're currently drafting an NDA to silence someone, then you're on your own.